Welcome to the Wyoming Department of Revenue's tutorial for the Form 42-1. The intent of this video is to guide you through the process for completing the form that is commonly used by annual filers in the state of Wyoming. When completing the form, the first step is to enter your total gross sales into line A. These sales will represent both taxable and non-taxable sales. However, it should not include the taxes collected at this time. Line B is where you will subtract any exemptions. Exemptions in this case are any sales that you have made that were considered non-taxable according to Wyoming Statute 39-15-105, which lists those sales and leases that are exempt from sales tax. Please note that exemptions are construed narrowly. Exemptions are legislative acts of grace from the normal rule of taxability. It is the responsibility of the purchaser to be certain that an exemption is available. It is the responsibility of the vendor to be certain that the purchaser's exemption is documented. By law, vendors must retain copies of exemption certificates and direct pay permits of exempt transactions for audit purposes for a minimum of 3 years. After you subtract line B from line A, you will enter the total into line C. This is your total sales that are considered taxable in the state of Wyoming. Keep in mind that some businesses may never have any exempt sales, so they would just enter the total sales from line A into line C. At this point, you will drop down to Part 2 and complete this section before returning to line D. This is where you will report the amount of tax collected for any reporting jurisdictions that you have made. Keep in mind, you can find the jurisdiction name and digit codes in the vendor's manual as well as online at the following address. In this case, the business had sales for the year of $1,000 that occurred in Laramie County at a tax rate of 6%. So you will enter the jurisdictional codes into columns 1, 2, and 3 and place X's into all 4 quarters in the column 4. As there were no tax changes in that county for the year. The reportable tax of $60 would then be entered into column 5 for sales tax due. At this point, when you add up the amount of tax that you have actually collected from your invoices or receipts, it is possible that you may have actually overcollected tax. This can occur either by rounding up or possibly a mistake in the math during the sale. If the overcollection was not refunded to the customer, then you are required to list the excess tax collected you entered into column 7. In this case, there was $1 that was overcollected. Please keep in mind that if you undercollect the tax, the whole amount owed is still due to the state of Wyoming. Column 6 is used to report any use tax owed by a vendor who has made purchases outside of the state of Wyoming for their own use. This does not refer to any items that the vendor buys with the intent to resell to their customers. Examples of this would be if you were to purchase a computer, point-of-sale system, cash register, tables, chairs, display cases, tools, etc., that you are using in the course of your business with no intention of selling them to a customer. In this case, the vendor purchased an item outside of the state of Wyoming and they were not charged any tax on the item that they were consuming. The item cost $625, so they will enter $37.50 into column 6. If the vendor had paid 3% tax to that other state for the purchase, then the state of Wyoming would give them a consideration for the tax paid, and they would only have to report $18.75 in this column. In the case that the vendor would have purchased the item in a state where the tax rate was higher than the vendor's home county rate, then the vendor would not have to report any tax due. Please keep in mind that if you are in a county that the tax rate is different from the 6% in the example, then whatever tax rate for your county will apply. Next, you will add the totals from columns 5, 6, and 7 together and report them into column 8. The vendor in this case also had sales in Crook County of $2,083.33. That occurred in the first, second, and third quarters of the year, when the tax rate that was in effect was 6%. So in columns 1, 2, and 3, you will list the jurisdictional codes and tax rate for Crook County. Since the sale took place in the first through third quarters, you will place an X in the respective quarters in column 4. Then you will report the tax due in column 5, which would be $125. In this case, there was no excess tax due, so you will carry the total from column 4 over to column 8. The vendor also had sales in the fourth quarter in Crook County. However, the tax rate had dropped from 6% down to 5%. To record this, you will list the jurisdictional codes again in columns 1 through 3, and then place an X in quarter number 4 in column 4. The vendor had sales of $700 in the fourth quarter, so they would record the tax collected of $35 into column 5. Again, there was no excess tax collected, so you will enter the amount of tax collected into column 8. The vendor had sales that occurred in Natrona County of $200. Since there were no tax changes during the year, you can mark all 4 quarters with an X. Again, you will enter the tax collected of $10 into column number 5. There was no excess tax collected, so then you will enter the amount into column 8. At this time, you will add the 4 totals together and enter the total into line I. In the case that the vendor may have more than 4 jurisdictions to report for, then you may need to contact the Wyoming Department of Revenue for a supplemental Form 42-2 and complete it for the additional counties that need to be reported. In this case, the vendor made sales in Sheridan County, so following the same format that was used in Part 2, you will enter the proper jurisdictional code and tax rate into columns 1, 2, and 3, and place an X into all 4 quarters since there was no tax rate changes during the year. The vendor had sales of $416.67 at a tax rate of 6%. So you will then enter the tax of $25 into column 5. In this case, they also had overcollected tax of $1, so the amount of excess tax will be reported into column 7. You will then add columns 5 and 7 together and enter the total of $26 into column 8. Once you have recorded all your sales, then those totals will be added together and listed at the bottom of the Form 42-2. Then you will carry that figure over to the Form 42-1 and enter it into line J. You will then indicate the number of supplemental pages that were used in the box provided. Since we only used 1, we will indicate this here. At this point, you will add lines I and J together and place the total into line K. Then this figure will be carried up to line D for the total jurisdictional taxes due. This brings us to the vendor compensation credit. In order to qualify for this, your account must be in good standing with the state of Wyoming, which means all returns currently due must be filed and paid in full, and the account may not have any outstanding balances. Also, the return must be filed and paid for by the 15th of the month, rather than at the end of the month when it is due. Vendors are allowed a credit of 1.95% of the tax due for the first $6,250 in collected tax. Anything over that is calculated at 1%. Please note, the vendor compensation credit may not exceed $500 in any reporting period, and the vendor in this case means the ownership, not the individual licenses. Please refer to the vendor's manual or contact the Wyoming Department of Revenue if you have any questions. So in this case, the vendor is filing and paying the return by the 15th of the month and is eligible for the credit. Since they have $294.50 owing in sales tax, they will multiply that amount by 0.0195. This would equal $5.74, and that would be entered into line E. Line F is an area which you can record any penalties and interest or late fees that you may owe the state of Wyoming due to delinquent returns, late payments, etc. Keep in mind that if this does pertain to you, then in turn you will be disqualified from taking the vendor compensation credit. So in this case, nothing is owed and it can be left blank, or you may enter 0. Line G is for a credit memo. You can receive a credit memo from an overpayment or a vendor compensation credit that was not used, or even an amended return on the account. It is always advised that if the state shows a credit listed on your return, that you contact the Department of Revenue to verify that the credit amount is accurate. In this case, the vendor has a valid credit on the account of $10. You will then subtract lines E and G from line D and enter the total into line H. This will give you the total amount due to the state of Wyoming. It is incredibly important that you sign the return and complete the information to the right. The return can be rejected if it has not been signed or the math does not work out. Please be careful that you do not date the return in the area directly below the signature line unless it is your intention to close your license. This concludes the tutorial. Please keep in mind that if you have any questions or concerns, you may contact the Department of Revenue at the following numbers. We truly appreciate all of our Wyoming vendors. Thank you.